Our next and last guest lecturer is Professor Miigel Senteno. Professor Miigel Senteno is the head of the Sociology Department at Princeton University, rated as the #1 department in sociology all over the United States. Professor Senteno is a political sociologist. His main interests include globalization and development, neoliberalism, war, and state building. Professor Senteno has published many articles, chapters, and books, most recently, State Making in the Developing World, and, in my hand, War and Society, both published in 2016. In his lecture today, Professor Senteno will focus on the impacts of war on civil society. Professor Senteno, please.
Hello. First of all, thanks to Mayor and Carmet for their wonderful arrangements and hospitality. This is my first time in Israel, and they have given me a wonderful introduction to it. I also realize that I am the only barrier between you and a well-deserved tea, beer, dinner, beach, whatever it is. So I will try to keep it short, but I often lie. So we have spent the last day talking about trauma and suffering and its lasting effects. It is obvious that violent conflict produces massive destruction and that the consequences remain for years afterwards. Over and above, for example, the horror of what's been going on in Syria for the last 6 years is the awareness that this is going to mark generations. Syria will be living with the consequences of the civil war arguably for 100, if not more years. So we've been talking about trauma. We've been talking, in a sense, what the effect is, the negative effects of any kind of violence or disruption, what this does to a society, what this does to an individual. I've been asked to take a very different take, and I hope those of you who actually have faced battle. I have never been in combat. So all of my learning is from libraries and interviews. So I hope you won't take offense of this, but it's based on historical and sociological analysis. And I want to make sure that you understand that I do not come to praise war, but I want to argue that we have to understand it better. And basically the argument that I want to make is that the very experience that produces trauma, in the case of war, for example, or in the case of conflict, might also in the end build resilience. That there is sort of, in a sense, almost a cyclical kind of relationship. That trauma, in a sense, produces a hardiness, if you will, a resilience, a robustness, which might in the end be helpful in the next trauma. So what do I mean by this? Now, some of you who are my age or a little bit younger might remember a musician called Edwin Starr, and he asked in a famous song, "War, what's it good for?" And the chorus was, "Absolutely nothing." Okay, and then he would go, "Say it again." Okay, and this was a big theme in I think it was released in 1969 in the midst of Vietnam, and it was a big theme in the certainly during the 1960s and throughout now. That war is all negative, that war doesn't produce anything, that war merely destroys. I want to argue the somewhat contradictory position that war might actually be a constructive act or phenomenon. And we can take this from the macro level of war to the micro level of a particular conflict. So we might take it from how Israeli society, for example, has reacted to the last 50 years of conflict, or actually 75 years of conflict, or we might look at small kibbutzim in the Gaza envelope and how they respond not so much to war but to the daily threat of conflict. And I want to do that by highlighting how war helps build three institutions that we closely associate with political modernity. If you think about what political modernity means, what we mean by a society being modern in its politics. And I'm going to talk about these three, and then I'm going to argue that there's not necessarily deterministic, but that war can have this effect under certain conditions, and I'll talk about that. So what are these three institutions that I say define political modernity? One is the state, the second is nationalism, and the third is citizenship or democracy. And let me talk about how war, in a sense, helps build each one. But first of all, I want you to think about the trinity, this trinity of state, nationalism, citizenship, and democracy, how we almost cannot imagine a modern society not having some combination of these. And we talk about state-building exercise, we talk about nation-building exercises, we talk about democracy or citizenship-building exercises, and we think of our modern world as composed of states that represents nations and that include citizens. So, what happens, what is war about? Let me begin with the state. And again, that's the macro level. We might think on the micro level that we have been talking about today of the state as the organization of resilience. These resilience centers, in a sense, are the version of the state in these small communities. So these are, the state is and here I follow the work of every single sociologist must mention Max Weber at least once, if not twice, Hintze and Chuck Tilley. And we can think of the state as the fulcrum of collective action. The state is at the very center of any possibility of collective action past a certain size. Once you get past a kin group, and there's lots of psychological analysis showing about how small you have to be able to be self-organized. But let's say past some arbitrary number, 100 people, 150 people, 1,000 people, you need a set of institutions. You can no longer rely on the sort of immediate atomistic contacts between the individuals. You need some kind of institution to be able to make those individuals work together. The state is that set of institutions that manages large collective action projects. They can be construction of infrastructure, if you will. They can be mutual defense. They can be collective well-being. The state, in a sense, is the institution that represents the ideals, the political ideals of that society, and brings those ideals to fruition in some way or the other, whether, again, it's building the high-speed railroad from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, whether it's welfare benefits for new immigrants. All these, you need some kind of state. And the state is at this very strange thing that we have, which is collective self-oriented behavior. That is, we're all supposed to behave very selfishly and very individualistic. But if you think about it, the state is what enables us to take those kinds of individual self-interest and construct a collective self-interest. So you might have your self-interest as individuals, but somehow the state is what allows you to have self-interest as Israelis. Okay, not as an individual, but as Israelis, as Americans, as Italians, as whatever it is. It's at the very heart of our ability to cooperate. Again, if you think about it, the state is what makes it possible for us to sort of do things together. When I talk about this with my students, I ask them to think about how long it takes for their roommates, for example, to come up with a cleaning schedule for the room. There's only 4 or 5 individuals. Okay, the state, in a sense, is I'm staying at a hotel right by the beach. And every half hour or so, with all the Kadima balls, by the way, incredibly frustrating after about 7 days, you will hear these announcements, which I can't understand a word, and that's the state. The state is basically saying, hello, you idiots, will you please come in, okay? You're swimming too far. The state, in a sense, provides that kind of protection. The state is what looks out after us. And at its most fundamental, the state serves to extract some resources from the society and then use them for collective goods. So the state, in a sense, is this machine. It collects these resources from society in one form or another, and then it produces something at the end, sometimes efficiently, sometimes not. Some states produce much less than they actually take out. Some states actually are able to multiply those resources. So think of the state as this machine that extracts from one side and produces outputs on the other. And it does so through something like taxes. Taxes is the fundamental, all states tax. Okay, and all a tax is that I say to the subjects or the members of this community, you will each have to pay this amount so I can produce X. Now again, that X can just be a very large palace for myself, or that X can be an infrastructure, or that X can be an educational system. So how does war help this? War, I don't know if there's an expression in Hebrew of necessity is the mother of invention. we don't think of new things except when we need to. All of a sudden, I need a tool. There's a tiger coming at me. I need some kind of weapon. Or I am faced with a task. I need to come up with it. In a geopolitical Darwinistic environment, war is the ultimate challenge to the continued existence of a society. War is not a vague threat. War is a very, very clear threat. I was talking to another colleague at Haifa yesterday. We were having dinner, and he was telling me about being in the Sinai in October 1973. He and about 15 others in a battalion, and all they could see from one end of the horizon to the other were Egyptian tanks coming at them. That is a signal. You better come up with something. It might be running away. It might be asking for an artillery barrage, whatever. It might be just giving up. But if you think about this over a long term, those kinds of threats make societies come up with some kind of invention, some kind of institutional development in order to defeat that threat that is coming in. War, in this way, is a natural selection by which societies can survive. That is not to say that it's a beneficial evolution. Okay, this is not to say that war is going to produce the best things. But if we think of an environment where war has been introduced, where violence has been introduced, only those societies that are able to develop some kind of means of war, some way of protecting themselves, will survive. This is particularly true in the case of war, because war is not just about violence. War is about organized violence. War is about getting violence together in a coherent form, okay? So it actually is greater than the sum of its parts. If you look at the classic formation of a phalanx is not the collective energy of 20 by 20, let's say 400 hoplites. The phalanx has its own energy that it comes from. This is why so much of military tactics are not necessarily about destroying the enemy, but disrupting the organization of the enemy. You don't necessarily need to kill all the soldiers. You need to spread them out. You need to break up that collectivity. So war is often a competition about who can collect, who can gather, in a sense, enough of their individuals to make this collective goods. The state is that institution which organizes that violence on behalf of internal and external violence. So war produces states because war produces the requirement for states. You might be happy in a Rousseauian state, eating fruit, whatever, sitting on the beach, but if all of a sudden a collective enemy comes through, okay, you're going to have to unite in some way in order to face that organized violence. So as Chuck Tilley put it, states make wars, and wars make states, okay? So it's a cycle. And very much like I was saying that trauma can produce resilience, which can produce more trauma, which can produce resilience. So states are our response to wars, but we also need states to fight wars. If we didn't have states, everybody, those of you who have been in combat know that combat is chaotic. But behind that chaos of the individual violence, there's a great deal of organization. You do not cross the Suez Gulf either this way or that way in a chaotic procedure. You need a huge amount of organization in order to do this. Think of Masada. We were just in Masada the other day. That fortress could only be built by a state. I was amazed. Well, first of all, after I got over my 3 heart attacks of walking up the snake path, I was amazed about how big that was. And think about what kind of organization, again, not necessarily a benevolent organization. No one ever called Herod a benevolent ruler. The number of slaves dying. But just getting all the slaves there to be able to carry all that stone and actually construct that. That is there because it is a fortress. Those states that cannot do this, for example, Poland in the 18th century, or many attempts to create political autonomy in the 20th and the 21st century, they fail. Why? Because they can't, in the end, produce the amount of violence necessary to survive in that environment. Now, does organized violence always make states? No. You need a couple of preconditions. You need an initial authority around which to build. And it can be random. It can be simply a warrior chief. It can be a family. It can be a town. It can be a mini-state that develops into an empire. You need a core, in a sense, around which the state can develop. But you have to have that core. If all you are faced with is, if you're chaotic internally and the violence comes to you, you're not going to be able to do this. You need some kind of central seed, in a sense. You also need an elite that's willing to use all the resources for the maintenance of that war machine in that society. You need a non-selfish elite. You need an elite that says, we can extract these resources and I could just have, I could sit in a la Herod and Masada, I can sit in my pool eating peacock eyes and grapes or whatever it might be, or I can use these resources that I'm extracting from the society for the preservation of that society. And the elites do this partly because they might be motivated by some kind of patriotism, or often just to survive. So elites want to survive. They see other elites competing with them. So they want to use the resources they extract from a society in order to assure their own protection. So please understand that I'm not saying this is a good thing, necessarily. War has made horrific states. If we look at, for example, one of the organization or sociological wonders, as horrific as it may be, especially for talking about this in Israel, is the survival of Nazi Germany, let's say from 1941 through 1945. It is able to do that because the state of war has created an incredible organization. That's not to say that what a great product, Nazi Germany. Or we see the success of the Soviet Union after the Civil War, after the Russian Civil War, or after World War II. That produced a society that we might not like, okay, but that it is much stronger than it was before. And it can use this coercive power both to maintain order at home, therefore it extracts more resources, and in order to protect itself from external enemies. And what's really striking is that historically and archaeologically, the rise of collective violence and the rise of agriculture and urban civilization appear simultaneously. I think one of the things that defines us as humans is not that we're peaceful, but that we can practice war. We're the only species that can actually mass and get that organized. And one of the questions I always ask my students is, do cities make walls or do walls make cities? Which comes first? The fact that you have a city or the fact that you construct a wall around it in order to protect it? I'll go a little faster because I realize you're all dying to get out of here. The second institution that we might look up for war's creative power is nationalism. And nationalism, if again talking about the micro level that we've been talking about today, might be the social capital that a group needs in order to have resilience. Nationalism can be defined, as George Massey, an absolutely wonderful scholar, as a people worshiping themselves. So nationalism is, you're sitting there, and the most famous example of this is the 1980, the hockey game between the United States and the Soviet Union. USA, USA. Well, these are people, or if you go to a Brazilian soccer match or whatever it is, it's people going, aren't we great, aren't we great, aren't we great? Nationalism is about placing allegiance in a broad collective over and above individual or even kin interests. Think about this. If a soldier leaves his family to go to war, we could portray him as deserting his family. But because of nationalism, we see him or her as a hero. He is putting this collective identity, he is putting this sense of a collective identity over and above his family interests. Now, in order to have nationalism, you have to predefine what is a nation. Again, you have to define what that core is. And here, war is a perfect device for demarcating the boundary between us and them. Okay? War presents the other as a threat against which all defense must be organized. And war is just, it's automatic. I was asked in 2003, 2004, what would I recommend for a new Iraqi government to come together? And this is before the Civil War, and et cetera. And I facetiously said, declare war on Syria. Saddam Hussein does this. I mean, what saves the Iranian Revolution is Saddam Hussein's stupidity in invading it. You create an enemy, and all of a sudden, this sense of an us is much more powerful, and this presence of a them. So it does two things. It both it shows you who you are not, and it also increases the bonds that binds us together. Think of the symbols of almost all modern states, okay? Be they statues, place names, flags, anthems. If you haven't actually listened to the lyrics of the Marseillaise, it's bloodthirsty. It's about soaking the ground in the blood of the other. I mean, in Israel, could you even say that there is an Israeli identity separate from the struggle that it has faced since 1948? It is precisely that state of permanent emergency, of permanent war, in a sense, that defines what Israeli nationalism is again. Soldiers tend to be the most common forms of representing the nation. I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s, what is the archetypal image of the Israeli is one of the paratroopers praying or crying at the Wailing Wall. It is the soldier. That is what Israel is about. Soldiers, in a sense, are the secular saints around which the faith of nationalism is built and around which the church of the state is built. Again, consider the memorials across Europe. Everywhere you go along Europe, you will see, or the United States, in every single small plaza, you will see a monument to a soldier. After 1918 in France, there were catalogs of poilus, so you could have your poilu going like this, or like this, or like this, or like this, and you could make all your monuments. And if you go across these, or you will see the plaques commemorating the dead. Or, again, consider the impossibility of creating what we might call, not a Jewish nation, but the Israeli nation or the Palestinian nation without conflict. How much of both of your identities, in a sense, are built around that conflict. So war serves to form the in-group and also to demarcate the out-group. Always? No. The effect of war can be destroyed if fissures appear in that us. If all of a sudden that us starts cracking, and it can be ethnic, it can be class, it can be religious, these perpetual divisions can retard the development of a nation, or you can have a nation, it's developed, and all of a sudden you become aware of these divisions. Oh, we might be Israeli, but you're Sephardic and I'm Ashkenazi, or vice versa. So those kinds of divisions, in a sense, and it's an empirical test almost, that whether the gravitational force of the us is going to defeat the centrifugal force of division. So if you think about it again, using the case of Israel, you can imagine different phases in Israeli history, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, where the idea of being Israeli or being Jewish is paramount, and then there are times when the idea of being Ashkenazi or Moroccan or whatever it might be paramount. And states and nations, in a sense, go back and forth along this empirical spectrum. This happens when an elites fight. All of a sudden, it's very self-serving elite who goes, you thought we were all X, but we're actually X prime and X squared and X cubed. You thought you were all Israelis, but you're really blanky blank and blank and blank. Again, consider Masada. If all of a sudden you had a difference of opinion about the sacrifice, or if you found out that one group was committing suicide and the other one was not, and all of a sudden that notion of the unity of Masada would be broken. And this leads us to the third social institution that war can help, or conflict can help. That is citizenship, democracy, and equality. That is the participation, the daily participation, or the common participation in this process of resilience. Citizenship is seen as freedom, okay? But actually it's a product of the nation and the state and the nation. It is in some form a chaining. It is saying you belong to this. Citizenship is a form of political property and claim over some equal share of some good. It's also a claim of the state over that citizen. So it's this mutual claim on each other. Now, war requires sacrifice, particularly of blood, but also requires sacrifice of taxes, etc. And you can use coercion to make people fight, but ever since Marathon, and the myth of Marathon, is that a group of motivated hoplites can beat thousands and thousands of slave soldiers. that a coerced army does not function, that you need an army that feels itself as part of this community. Now, if the state is going to require people to participate in war, if it says, by the way, all those Egyptian tanks coming, they're coming for us, you have to go defend them, okay, then the person going, okay, I'll do that, but I want something in return. I want some kind of benefit. For example, you see this in Athenian history. As the Athenian navy progresses, the people who row the ships claim more and more rights vis-a-vis the hoplites. These are people who did not have the money to pay the equipment, but they are rowing the galleys. Therefore, they claim, okay, you want us to row the galleys? You want us to die in these battles? Well, you have to give us some rights. And you especially see this in the 15th to the 16th century with the gunpowder revolution, when all of a sudden you no longer have warriors, but you have armies. You have armies of soldiers. When you need a mass army composed of individuals willing at some point or another to suffer. Okay? War is basically about imposing suffering on others and also accepting suffering on yourself. And war, in a sense, that creates the possibility that the states have to give something back. There's a wonderful old Swedish saying, one rifle, one vote. Okay? And you can see this in all three forms of Marshallian democracy, whether it's individual rights, political rights, or social rights. You want me to fight? Well, then you have to respect my rights. You want me to fight? Well, then you have to give me my vote. Or beginning in the 20th century, you want me to fight, okay? You have to, after World War I, the British are not going to tell all the Tommies that they have to go back to tipping their hats, etc. No. Now they start demanding rights. They demand education for their children. Think about how closely tied conscription and citizenship are. Who are the citizens? Those who are willing to fight. It's a political exchange. Does it always work? No. When the state fails to deliver, when it says, yes, go out, kill, die, and when you come back, we'll reward you. And then when you get armies who come back and they're not rewarded, okay, because the state has used up its resources. That can kill that allegiance, that link between war and citizenship. Then the exchange breaks down. Is it any accident, for example, that in the OECD, in the rich part of the world, inequality has gone up as conscription has gone down? And the relationship is almost perfect. As the state needs fewer and fewer soldiers, it has less and less interest in providing for all. Or is there any accident that gender rights have been accompanied by greater female participation in battle? I am as good as you, I can hold an Uzi, I can face these Egyptian tanks. Well, that means that I will not be whistled at in the street, or that I have every right to do whatever I want. When elites no longer feel that they're part of a population, when elites can buy their protection, this is very dangerous. When elites can buy their protection rather than creating it organically, then you get this breakdown between citizenship and conflict. Again, consider Masada. If some of the families in Masada could have bought their way out. All right, well, here's a little bit of, Josephus, let's not forget that Josephus first says no to a suicide, then he starts writing about a suicide. So if you could buy your way out of that, you could say, well, you guys all stay here and all die, and I'm going to go down the stairs and I'll get out. If you do that, if an elite stops serving, and this is particularly a problem in the United States where roughly 1% of the population participates, and the relationship between income and serving in the military is very negative. My students at Princeton do not serve in the military. And that is a very dangerous, because essentially what you're saying is you do this, but we keep all the goods. So is war or conflict always a good thing? Obviously no. The lack of basic institutional capacity, social divisions, or inequality can diminish positive aspects of war. And I want to just finish up. Meir asked me to just talk a little bit about war in the 21st century, etc. I think one of our challenges is how do we construct collective institutions a sense of belonging and equal access without war? Is there any way that we can come together in states, as nations, as citizens, without, in the book that Clement was so kindly advertised, available on Amazon, please. One of the things I note is that, modern political institutions, again, the state, nation, citizenship, are very much tied to the process of war. What happens when you no longer have war? Imagine, if you will, perhaps something that would be a fantasy for many of you. Would Israel survive peace? Or would it, in a sense, almost start coming apart? Because what holds it together is this perpetual threat. The United States, I watched the United States after 1989, from 1989 to 2001, not knowing who to hate. The Russians were gone. The United States started hating Colombian drug lords. I mean, things like this, because there was nobody else, because we needed someone that wasn't us, that affirmed the us. If you want to say humanity has come together, but it has come together in a sense by competing against others. Bits of humanity have come together by fighting other bits of humanities. And if you really wanted one globe, now this is where people get mad at me because I say these kinds of things, but if you wanted world peace, I have one solution: an invasion by alien lizards. I can assure you, if all of a sudden alien lizards come down, people will be going, okay, I'm Sephardic, you're Ashkenazi, but you're warm-blooded. Okay, Shia, Sunni, Protestant, Catholic, Israeli, Palestinian. All of a sudden, oh, okay, and then the minute the lizards are defeated, you know what's going to happen. Blah, 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 blah. It's going to go back. But the real question then is, how do we create this sense of communities in worlds without wars? In a world without war, in a world without this conflict, can you have community without war? And that is a very difficult question, particularly for a state like Israel. And on that, I'll let you be. Thank you.